Hi. I sit in front of you all now in shame, and I owe many apologies. I feel that I've not only been flippant with my wording, but also grossly ignorant about certain claims I've made or alluded to. Last year, in the lead up to The Exorcist Believer coming out, I decided to review every movie in the Exorcist franchise, and in that series, I titled my review for The Exorcist II in such a way that I was including it among the worst horror sequels of all time. I feel now that I owe an apology. Not just to you, my blossoming audience, but mainly to Exorcist II, the heretic. For I now know that I grossly mischaracterized that movie. After my recent viewing of Omen IV: The Awakening, I've found that there is less color in the world. Food doesn't taste like anything. My favorite albums are nothing but noise, and I've developed a severe drinking problem in my attempts to erase my memory of Omen IV. After booking therapy within minutes of the credits rolling, I had my first appointment earlier this week and was told that I am far and away the most traumatized patient they've ever spoken to, and said my best course of action would be to do just this, to sit in front of all of you in humility at my most vulnerable, afraid, and apologize. So I'm sorry to all of you, and I'm especially sorry to Exorcist II, the heretic, which I couldn't stop wishing I was watching the whole time I was watching Omen IV: The Awakening. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll accept my words. The Omen III brought the story of Damien Thorn as the Antichrist to a close in a pretty definitive way, but if there's one Antichrist that just can't be defeated, it's the appeal of a recognizable IP in the eyes of producers. Not that the Omen franchise was the most lucrative, but it made some money during its run from 1976 to 1981, so 10 years after the final conflict, a direct-to-TV sequel titled Omen IV: The Awakening, released with a screenplay from Brian Taggart and co-directed by Jorge Monazzi and Dominique Othenin-Girard. Good evening. My name's Evan, and welcome to Rocklin Graves. I don't think The Omen needed any sequels. I think it works best as a standalone film, but I didn't mind Omen 2 and actually had a pretty fun time with the third movie. After I put up my video on the first one and mentioned that I'd be covering the franchise in the lead up to the prequel that's coming out soon, I saw some differing opinions about the second and third movies and which one was better, but the one consistent thing that everyone seemed to be on the same page about was that the fourth was going to be a rough one. One of the things that kept pleasantly surprising me with this franchise as I was going through it is that while the sequels aren't perfect, there was never that Exorcist II moment throughout any of the trilogy. I can say, there is still no Exorcist II moment in the Omen franchise because Omen IV: The Awakening is way, way worse. This is one of the most painful movies I've seen in a long time, and I was not joking when I said I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd much rather be watching Heretic while this Blu-ray was surely infecting my PlayStation with some horrific STI. I need to get this video over with so I can start working on pretending this movie just doesn't exist.
Do you remember that simple prayer of thanks I taught you?
No.
There is one saving grace about this movie, and that's that its plot and setup are so inconsequential and unrelated to anything that happened in the trilogy that you can entirely disregard it when thinking about the overarching narrative of The Omen. Damien Thorn's story is over, and he's not in this movie. The direction they chose to take was to have a new Antichrist child, Delia, who gets adopted by a congressman. I'm not even sure where to really begin when talking about all the things wrong with this movie. I'll get this out of the way right at the top. Jerry Goldsmith did not return to score this movie, and the way the music was handled is such a confused mess. Jonathan Sheffer was the one tasked with the score here, and it often feels like he was writing music for different scenes than the ones it's used in. It never feels like it matches the tone of the scene, almost sounding whimsical during scenes that should have a sense of foreboding. It doesn't come across as a creepy creative decision, it just feels confused. Some of Goldsmith's music is used sparingly throughout the movie, but it's literally just the exact same score from the first movie, haphazardly placed in random spots, and while I usually be very happy to hear Goldsmith's score, it actually made me mad every time I heard it, because this movie does not even remotely deserve that kind of music, and it felt disrespectful to what Goldsmith wrote. The score of The Omen is one of its strongest and most defining elements, so to hear this really unfocused, tonally inaccurate music is, well, it's actually a really accurate representation of the movie overall. It's another way that Omen IV feels completely separated from the previous three movies, and while that would usually not be a great thing for a sequel, I am incredibly grateful that that's the case here. The thing that this franchise focuses on seems to shift around a fair bit, where the first one was very much focused on this story of the Antichrist being adopted into a powerful family, and Robert Thorne slowly learning about his son's true nature as the story unfolded. It wasn't so much about Damien as it was about Robert and his search for answers after more and more signs show themselves, and it's great. Omen II had a much heavier focus on the elaborate death scenes that certainly played a role in the first, but they weren't nearly as over the top. It kind of feels like a Final Destination movie at times, especially since there isn't really a whole lot in terms of story that wasn't already covered by the first movie. Then Omen III focused on this really fun race against time for the climax of Damien Thorn's story as he's hunted down by 7 priests from the Subiaco monastery who want to take him down before he finds the second coming of Christ. It pointed itself right at Damien actually having serious political power for the first time in the franchise, and it felt quite grand at times. So that brings us to Omen IV, which seems to have completely forgotten that these movies ever had any story, especially in the first act. It's basically just a slideshow of death scenes for a long time. There really isn't any amount of plot introduced to this movie until around halfway through, because up to that point it's just Delia killing random people or making a kid piss his pants because he's scared of heights. Seriously, there is next to nothing happening in this movie for what feels like an eternity, and what makes it worse is that the death scenes aren't even remotely cool or creative. I wasn't a huge fan of how over the top the deaths in the second movie were, but I would give my left nut for something even half as fun or creative as the least interesting deaths from that movie. The only ones that stood out were this fire Delia starts at a stoner's farmer's market, and another that's basically just a straight up recreation of Keith's death from the first movie, but nowhere near as cool or shocking because you just don't give a flying fuck about anyone or anything going on here, and you've already seen this before. It happens to the father of the kid that Delia has been butting heads with because he keeps telling the school and her parents that she's all fucked up and is a huge problem, so she just decides enough is enough. Again, this is a made-for-TV movie, so it shouldn't be any surprise that some of the production value isn't all that great, but there's a moment in this movie where the sound design was so bafflingly horrific that I just need to show it to you. That's almost as bad as Killers of the Flower Moon. Seriously, what the fuck was up with the sound design in that movie? Even in a low-budget, made-for-TV, nothing sequel, this kind of thing is just pure insanity. The movie also looks super flat, with really poor cinematography and a bland color palette, and when you've already got nothing to enjoy plot-wise, there are basically no characters, the sound design is horrible, and the only thing they decide to focus on in the movie is also boring as shit, and then it all looks like a drab, bland, cheap shit show. It's not fun to say the least. So Delia gets adopted from a nun-run orphanage, and right away she shows signs of being an evil little brat. She scratches her mother with her baby finger and baby fingernail so badly she bleeds and it gets infected, which makes no sense at all, but this is sort of the Antichrist, so I'll throw the movie at least a bone and let that one slide. I know I said sort of the Antichrist, I'll explain that at the end. Anyway, it's only after the family adopts a Rottweiler that saves Delia from getting hit by a truck that she really starts to become a nuisance and showing more signs of being devilish, like her getting pissed off at the sight of healing crystals.
Isn't that pretty?
Yeah, for some reason this movie tries to implement a lot of New Age stuff, which I guess I don't have an inherent issue with, but it seems really arbitrary, like they were just trying to come up with some new angle, though they just threw everything and nothing at the wall. It doesn't really change much of anything, but I mean, this scene is pretty funny. She's brought to a fair full of psychics and they all get scared by her, so she just causes a fire and walks away. A lot of this movie really is just biding time with these really random scenes that contribute nothing to the overall story. Like this one where Delia bites the doll's face and all the adults act like it's some deeply disturbing sign that a young child would bite a toy.
She almost took the head clean off.
She's got some chompers is all. There isn't any actual story introduced until Delia's adoptive mother Karen finds out she's pregnant, which was unexpected since the reason they adopted was because her and Jean had tried many times for a baby and could never conceive. This pregnancy is one of the strangest and most convoluted plot points I've seen in a horror movie. We don't find out much about it until later on after Karen hires a private investigator to try and track down Delia's biological mother. I suppose this part of the movie isn't as bad as the first while we're just watching absolutely nothing happen, but that's not a very high bar, and it doesn't mean this is good. I will say that I did enjoy the performance from Michael Lerner as the private investigator. He's got more charisma to him than every single other element of this movie combined, and I also wanted to mention it because he unfortunately passed away last year. 2023 fucking sucked in a lot of ways. While I think this is the least terrible part of the movie, it shares the same issue that I had with Omen 2, where we're watching characters search for answers that we already have, except while Omen 2 was still a decently well-written movie and pretty damn entertaining, this movie is an empty slog that is spiritually painful to watch. It says a lot that the movie's strongest element was my biggest criticism about Omen 2. I think one of the best things I can point to show why I think The Omen works best as a standalone movie is that 2 of the sequels are basically just telling the exact same story that the first one did, but not nearly with the same quality. We've got 3 Omen movies where the bulk of the story is an antichrist child who people grow ever more suspicious about and try hunting for answers about the child's true nature, and that isn't a storyline that's anywhere near as compelling after the first go-around because we, the audience, already know what all the answers are. Can't wait to watch the remake. We're just retreading the same ground over and over again, and each time we've done it, it's gotten worse. There's not much more we can get out of this narrative, which is why I appreciate the third movie so much. It didn't bother retreading any ground and told a new and exciting story that moved things forward, and then we go right back to just redoing the story of the first movie. While Omen 2 had some things to still set itself apart, like the Final Destination-esque death scenes, the solid performances from most of the cast, and a really charming comfort movie tone, Omen 4 has absolutely nothing to make up for the fact that it brings no new ideas to the table. For all its flaws, Exorcist II at least sets itself apart from the first movie and took some wild creative swings, telling a distinctly different story that, while I still really dislike it, can at least justify its existence and warrant a watch since it's such a bizarrely unique experience. I can't fucking believe I'm praising that movie in the way I am, but with experience comes perspective, and God almighty, how I'd prefer something that does the weirdest shit imaginable and misses over a lazy retread that's basically just the first movie story again with far less nuance and exponentially worse writing, acting, directing, and music. There is one new element that this movie introduces to the plot, so let's talk about that. As I said earlier, Delia is sort of the Antichrist. I hope you're sitting down for this one. So basically what happened is that Delia is apparently Damien's daughter, and fucking strap yourselves in, she carried the embryo of the Antichrist inside of her. The doctor who they've been seeing removed the embryo from Delia at the hospital and implanted it in Karen after she passed out from seeing the nanny die from falling out of a window. That's why Karen got pregnant, and she gives birth to Alexander, who's the real Antichrist, and Delia essentially serves as a protector to him since the Antichrist has to be a boy. That's a real story that someone wrote down and decided to make into a movie. A satanic embryo is removed from a 9-year-old girl and implanted into her adoptive mother by a Satan-worshipping doctor. I miss Robert Thorne, man. Remember how nice and simple that story was? It was great. This is one of the most, we have no idea what to do with this movie, so let's just throw some wild shit in there and hope that catches people's attention plotline I've seen in a while. So Alexander is the true Antichrist, which is confirmed when Karen sees the mark of the beast on his hand, and when she goes to shoot the little baby demon, the gun is turned towards her instead as she's controlled by the powers of Satan and blows her own head off, and the movie ends with what seems to be an attempted throwback to the end of the original, but with nowhere near the same amount of impact. So that's Omen IV: The Awakening. It completely misses the point of any singular element that makes the story of the Antichrist compelling, focusing next to nothing on the characters that made the original such an impactful viewing. Gene's the one who's climbing his way up in the world of politics, and he never once even knows anything's wrong with Delia because she always acts nice and sweet around him. He's the most underdeveloped character in the movie, which is the polar opposite of the original, where Robert was the most important character in that story. When you don't create any characters to care about, it's impossible to get remotely invested in putting a stop to the efforts of the Antichrist because there are no stakes. And this movie tries to fill the void with random bullshit death scenes until it finally decides to try moving the story forward a little bit, but contributes nothing we haven't already seen and does it tenfold worse than any past iteration. It's a bland, boring, flat, and uninspired sequel that offers absolutely nothing to the overall story of this franchise, and while I won't definitively say it's the worst horror sequel out there, I'm comfortable saying that it's far more painful than The Exorcist II by quite a wide margin. We've only got one more movie to look at before the prequel releases at the start of April, but before that I'll be taking a look at Sinister II, which I think might feel like a pretty damn good movie after watching Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, and Omen IV. Yeah, we're almost through with this franchise, but we've still got a few more reviews and then a ranking before it comes to a close. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.